Thank you very much for everyone for coming out today. This is the Venture Capital Insights panel. We're very fortunate today to have 4 distinguished venture capitalists with us. They get to see lots of companies through the funding process, hundreds of companies really, and then work very closely with the companies that they fund. So they have a unique perspective on kind of some of the things that are going on in the startup ecosystem. So we've asked each of the panelists to come up with an insight, something they've gleaned over the last 12 months in working with startups that they think would be interesting to share, and also a prediction for the coming 12 months, something they believe will evolve and happen and will significantly change the startup ecosystem. So we're fortunate enough to have them here to share those insights. We will be doing a quick Q&A at the end, so as the panel goes on, if you have any questions, please send them to vcinsights@amazon.com, and we'll take some of those at the close of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to have you guys do a quick introduction, and then we'll get started.
Am I starting? Perfect. Hey everybody, my name is Ariel Zeitlin. I'm with a venture firm called Scale Venture Partners. We invest in early in revenue enterprise software companies. So enterprise software is solely where we focus, and the stage where we come in is once there's a product in the market and there's early revenues kind of showing that there's a product market fit, then we come in order to invest into sales and marketing and really scale the business, hence the name Scale Venture Partners. I've been with the firm for about 2 years. Before that, I was on the operating side of the business, so my last role was at Netflix, where I was in charge of streaming operations and helping build out the cloud platform there. Obviously worked very closely with AWS and got to know a lot of the team there. So that's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Jake Flomenberg. I'm with Excel Partners. We're a global venture capital firm with offices in the Valley, in London, in India. We invest in both enterprise and consumer software, companies like Facebook, Dropbox, Cloudera, Slack, and our Series A early stage investing is our bread and butter, but we write checks from $500,000 to $100 million, so all shapes and sizes. I've been with the firm for about 3 years. Before that, I managed portions of the product team at Splunk and Cloudera and spent a lot of time focusing on data, infrastructure, data-driven applications, and security.
Hello, my name is Scott Rainey. I'm a partner with Redpoint Ventures. Redpoint's a firm that's based in Menlo Park with offices in China as well. We have 2 funds we invest out of. One is an early stage fund that invests in typically seed Series A investments in both the consumer and enterprise sectors. We also have a growth fund that focuses on companies that are a bit farther along. We just love to partner with entrepreneurs and attacking big markets and trying to build great companies and help them in any way we can. We've been investing in the cloud for some time now with investments on the floor here at companies like Heroku and Twilio and Platform9 and Looker and Moogsoft, a handful of others. So great to be here.
My name is Matt McElwain, and I'm a partner at the Madrona Venture Group. Madrona is an early stage information technology-based venture firm in Seattle, Washington. We're probably best known for being the first investors in Amazon. We have a long-time relationship. One of my partners is still on the board, and we have a great relationship with them, and going all the way back to, next year will be the 10th anniversary of the first Amazon Web Service being launched, S3, in the fall of 2006, so it'll be an exciting year for AWS.
Great, so we'll start with some insights. As I mentioned, these guys are fortunate enough to see lots of different companies and spend all of their time in the startup ecosystem. Ariel, you've seen some changes in the way that developers work. Why don't we start out with kind of what you're seeing?
Sure. I think one interesting kind of long-term trend over time is that we just continue seeing the layer of abstraction continue to rise over time. So we can go back to the 60s, but let's start with let's say the 2000s, where application servers were the way you built applications, right? You had your J2E and your .NET as the 2 primary vehicles, and when those came out, it was an incredible innovation in the market because you no longer had to worry about a lot of the plumbing of getting applications running and built. And that was great, but that was a point in time, and it was a good way of getting monolithic apps built and deployed. But then we kind of went through the whole SOA era, and now are kind of coming into this whole microservices architecture pattern, where we're taking basically large applications and we're shattering them into hundreds of different kind of point components, right? And I hate using microservices because that's such a buzzword, but it's a good way of describing it. So what you're seeing now is that organizations, internal development organizations, are starting to be structured in these kind of core teams that are managing each small service, and they're delivering that almost as a service internally to the rest of the organization. And what I've been seeing kind of recently over the past year, 2 years, is that companies are coming out and essentially saying, instead of you building, managing, and running this microservice, this little piece of undifferentiated infrastructure yourself, why don't you outsource that, and we'll provide that to you as a SaaS offering. So identity is a great example. Every single application out there needs identity. Whether you've got subscribers or users. There's generally nothing that's differentiated or IP specific in those services. So there's a bunch of companies out there that are providing identity as a service, and we invested in one recently called Stormpath. You can see that kind of across the landscape of different services that developers need in order to get their apps built and run. Now be outsourced, and basically what you get is you don't have to deal with the operations of it, and that's a huge value add. That was one of the big reasons that we see the shift towards the public cloud, right? Because we see running data centers and managing hardware as this operational overhead that's not really core to a business. So hey, let's outsource that to infrastructure as a service, and we believe that that's the future of how infrastructure is going to be run. So the opportunity there is if you're building a startup, then kind of thinking about, well, what are these services that nobody wants to build and run themselves, but are really core and important and kind of horizontal functionality. Messaging, logging, identity are kind of all great examples. And so that's one really interesting insight that I've seen. And I think just a really interesting kind of point to think about in that same vein is, open source has been a tremendous force over the last 10 or 15 years, and it's really enabled developers to get products to market more quickly, and also kind of addresses this exactly the same point of not having to reinvent the wheel and to rebuild basic components that everybody has to do, and now you can just get them as open source, right? Whether it's web servers or logging frameworks or you name it. It'll be really interesting to see whether this shift towards having these individual developer services offered as services by third parties, what that's going to do to the open source ecosystem, whether that's going to live alongside of it, and some folks are going to choose to use open source and run and operate it themselves, and others will consume it as a service, or whether it's going to subsume open source and become the dominant model, and that's something I don't have a prediction about.
So is this a case of open source being displaced by companies that are developing microservices that they then in turn sell to developers? Is that kind of what we're seeing?
That's exactly it, right? And the big question in my mind is I don't know whether it's going to displace it or just be another vehicle for delivering that service. Because open source is great, but a lot of organizations don't, they're trying to outsource more and more of the operational function. Right? So, when I was at Netflix, basically every single thing that we built as part of our cloud platform, we tried to open source the monitoring system, discovery, everything, right? Security management and so on. And that's all out there for everybody to consume as open source projects. But what we're seeing now is companies coming out that are offering very much those open source components as a service. Okay. Because there's still one more step after actually getting the open source package, which is now you got to run it and maintain it and scale it.
Sure. Anybody else seeing this kind of trend among your companies, either people that you're funding or companies that are using these services to get to market faster?
Well, certainly to talk about the open source, I think we've witnessed a shift perhaps in the past decade where maybe 2 decades ago there were a couple of success stories and it was a lot of more anti-establishment, let's give it away, let's make it free, right? And now I think we've seen over the last 10 years a tremendous amount of innovation of doing things that were fundamentally not possible in the proprietary ecosystem. Certainly in the data management layer with the advent of Hadoop and a variety of non-relational databases. But sort of to Ariel's point, we're in the early days of figuring out how to monetize these assets, right? What is the right, durable, sustainable model for how to build an open source business? Certainly hosting as a SaaS-related service is one option. Management and security are others. And we've seen a lot of startups that come to us with a very interesting project asset. And I think one of the important things that we start to think about is the sequencing of timing around these things. To first have a very successful project, then how do you turn that into the product and monetize? And making sure you get the timing right on those things can be quite important.
Yeah, I just don't see these things as mutually exclusive at all. I mean, I see open source as going to be this incredibly powerful trend that will continue indefinitely, and I see delivering these composable services as a business model, for the reasons that you articulated, that people don't want to operate this stuff, again, is a really attractive way of going to market. I think that what's interesting is we're seeing lots of open source businesses now who are choosing to think about, well, the way that I'm going to make money is I will open source this and I'll put it in the Apache Foundation, but then I'm going to I will operate this software as a service on behalf of my customers, and I'll do it better than they ever could because I understand the software more intimately than they can. So these things, I just don't think they're mutually exclusive. I really think these are business model questions. It's ultimately, in the end, what business do you choose to, how you want to end up choosing to monetize the software that you've written. So.
Okay, good, interesting. So Jake, you had some observations about kind of the rise of the API, or the APX, as I think you called it, and kind of the impacts that's going to have on the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, and it sort of builds off of a lot of what Ariel said, and I think in some sense, some startups don't have the opportunity, they don't have the luxury of choice. It's an absolute necessity for some of them to build on top of these services. And the term we use to describe this is APX, the API-ification of businesses, the API economy. As we started unpacking a lot of the fastest growing mobile startups and looking at their stacks, companies like Hotel Tonight that we're investors in, others like Uber that we're not, when you sort of peel it open, look under the hood, what's underneath there? There's, Uber has Google for Maps, it has Twilio for text, it has Braintree for payments, it even has Checker, an API for background checks. So just about everything that they can API-ify has been API-ified, and you could sort of argue that they're able to sort of stand on the top of these companies. They pay them a lot, certainly, but they provide the business logic, and they're able to capture the lion's share of the value. And I would argue that Uber wouldn't be able to exist today in its current form, with its current level of ease of use, if they had to have built all of these things that are underneath it. It would have taken decades. I don't think anyone would have, underwritten that asset. So they can only exist in the world today where they can stand on the shoulder of these services. And I think the trend towards the API-ification microservices is inevitable. I think it started to happen in mobile. I think everyone here today, with some of the announcements even this morning, we're changing our dev processes for how things are built internally, and it's going to happen everywhere else, from analytics infrastructure APIs to help broker your data along, from collaboration APIs that Slack is certainly used as a great growth vector. I think we're going to see this sort of framework as a key underpinning for how startups can execute and reach scale, to focus on the things that they do better. And I don't think it'll be a choice. Maybe it'll be a choice for some of the old companies that have to take time, but going forward, there really isn't much of a choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, one way to think about what AWS is it's kind of like the infrastructure sharing economy. And so you've got somebody who's been willing to put the capital forward and build the services as innovation, so that you now have a different kind of platform to build on. And so what are the types of things that you need if that's true? Well, one of the things you need some kind of framework so that you can, I call it stitch, all of these different workflows, these little sub-workflows together, so that you can build a service, like an Uber or a Smartsheet or a Slack or some of these kinds of different types of services. But what I think you're going to need more of, and what we're starting to see increasingly, is it's not just enough to stitch the workflows, the various SaaS offerings or little microservices together. You're going to increasingly have to stitch the data flows together. And that's where there's a lot of opportunity in the future, not just to stitch those data flows, but then to leverage the unique data repository and the infrastructure that you've built around that data repository, to leverage it to go from looking back in what we used to call business analytics to what we might think of now as sort of real-time data flows, ultimately leading to predictive analytics.
So do you think, as investors, have you become more comfortable with this notion of people putting together pieces? Because I know 15 years ago, when I was trying to raise money, very frequently had venture capitalists pick apart what we did, and anything that we didn't own or controlled was almost seen as a liability. And there was always a big push to own all your IP, and it's sounding like that's changing a little bit. Or
I think it's changed fundamentally, and I think AWS is a big driver for that. I mean, I think what happened 10 years ago as this started to unfold is it became clear that really these companies should focus on the things that ultimately are going to differentiate them. So I think the bigger question we ask when we see these businesses a lot of times is, now what's the defensibility of an individual company? What are you going to focus on? What is your differentiation going to be? If you're going to build services by tying together a bunch of composable APIs, what are you going to do? And we see, I think, many companies and many entrepreneurs who still struggle with this concept of trying to understand it's not just about integration at this point. You got to do more. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think one of the exciting things that this is really unleashed is, folks starting to spend a lot more time thinking about data and what they're going to do with the data that they have in their systems and how they're going to derive insights and value from that data and then turn around and offer that to users. And so you just see, really what this should be able to do is unleash the opportunity and the capacity for companies to do things which will make them very, very differentiated and more valuable over time.
But with this opportunity also comes a little bit of risk. And we around here, people used to joke that we would ask questions like, hey, what's your India strategy? What's your China strategy? Sadly, what's your big data strategy? And I think the most relevant question now is really what's your cloud strategy? And hopefully you don't walk me out of here in handcuffs for saying it, but what's your Amazon strategy is a real question to make sure that you're innovating on a layer with a business model that is not a pick and shovel that you might wake up one day, and find yourself having a very large competitor. And so making sure you're stitching that data in a way that provides true business user value and is not one of figuring out that right business model to stand next to these very large competitors that are innovating very fast is something that weighs on our minds, all of ours here, I'm sure, very heavily.
Yeah, there's different ways of creating differentiated value. You either have IP in the actual product that you've created, and obviously the level is rising there where you don't need to, like Jay said, rebuild a mapping system. And the fact that you don't have to do that is actually a benefit for Uber rather than a disadvantage, because who cares about mapping? That's not core to their IP. But you do have to have either some kind of IP in the business that creates a barrier to entry for somebody else, or you have to have some kind of a network effect that by being first and by signing up, like Facebook, Uber are great examples. Those aren't, they're not very complicated software systems to build. Facebook at this point, obviously with 1 billion users, has got scale that nobody else has. But in the early days, that wasn't a novel computer science problem, and anybody who wanted to, MySpace, and there's a ton of examples, could do. But the fact that they were able to create the network is what created the defensibility for them. So, I think you always got to think about what is it that's going to create the barrier for entry for somebody else coming in, and that doesn't have to be your algorithms. It could be other things.
Good. Did you have one?
I was just going to give an empirical data point. We do a survey every year of our companies, and this was the first year, actually, 100% of them are using one or more AWS services. The next closest cloud had, I think, 13% of our portfolio, and this is a sample of over 50, less than 100. And what was interesting, though, is the breadth now of services on AWS that people are using. So not just the far 8x lead, but the number of different things, whether it's load balancing services or services like Redshift, and really kind of helping these companies climb up that stack so they can focus on the things that will differentiate what they do.
Do you think there's a selection bias there, Matt?
Maybe.
Having the investor for Amazon.
So we see these new startups coming out developing microservices that are targeted at other developers who are going to develop more services on top of that. Scott, you and I had talked a little bit about kind of how that changes the way you think about go-to-market.
It's just kind of interesting where purse strings used to be controlled in these companies by a handful of folks. Now, really what we see is it's the rise of the developer. And so many businesses that we're investing in today, a core part of their strategy is building products and services that developers are going to love, that they're going to bring inside, they're going to start to use, and then ultimately they will end up powering these services, and you'll end up building businesses by taking money not from the developer budget, but from the core business budget that's associated with these services. And it's a really incredible tectonic shift that's happened,
Sure.
And it's super exciting. We're lucky to invest in companies like Heroku and Twilio and Stripe that are all leveraging this strategy of building products and services that we believe and hope that developers love. I think one of the things that we see, though, now in terms of a lot of startups is that maybe a little bit of confusion and then what that means in terms of types of businesses you should be thinking about building. So we like to say that we like these companies to sell through developers, not to developers. And
Okay.
that ultimately what we we see are a lot of companies that are emerging now that are trying to help developers become more productive in terms of next generation productivity tools and things like that. I think that's still a really difficult place to build big, large, scalable businesses, and it's mainly because there's generally developers don't spend a lot of money on themselves, and so what we encourage are folks that want to do this, who want to build products that, again, the developers love, that ultimately the dollars are going to come from some other part of the organization.
Right.
And I give all these composable services are great examples of that. And I think the other key in all this is I think that it's getting a little cynical here, and that a lot of companies have recognized this trend and are starting to build things that they say we want to offer something to the developer, but it's got to be the best companies here are the ones that are started by developers are building tools that they know that they would love. They build things that are going to win over the hearts and minds of developers that really ultimately, in a vacuum, a developer would see this API and would say, man, that is awesome, it's life-changing, I'm going to use this. And the fact that eventually ends up powering a big part of your service or whatever is kind of a side effect of all that. And we just encourage all the entrepreneurs we see that are thinking about trying to sell things through developers or even to developers to make sure that you really are, your heart's in the right place, and that you're building a product and service that the developers are going to love. And it's so easy to lose a developer's trust. I mean, you offer a product or service. I think many of you probably are developers in the audience here. You guys are great at sniffing out opportunism. And I think increasingly there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to try to take advantage of developers in that way. So.
Are there some clear business models that are emerging as you look at these kinds of services now that you're seeing?
Well, it's an interesting question. So we've talked about the APX economy and all those things. There's no one universal model that I think works. And a lot of the businesses we see here, it's difficult to think. So Stripe's a great example for us. It's just this infinitely scalable model, in that they take X% of transactions that happen through the system. In Twilio, there's a toll associated with the services that are being consumed, given the fact that we're interfacing with the telecommunications networks in many cases. So those have natural business models associated with them. There are others that have less natural business models associated with them, and it's hard to predict just how scalable those models ultimately will be. And Heroku's a great example of a company that's generating significant revenue now, but it took a long time to get there. I think there are a lot of businesses that are going to be selling into this APX economy that it's not going to be entirely obvious how you build real scalable business models that are going to work. So,
anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I mean, the only quick thing to add to that is I think that the whole excitement around containerization is partly a piggybacking on this theme. In other words, it's really putting more power back into the hands of the developers, because there is this layer of hardware turned into software as a service, or really infrastructure as a service, and I can abstract on top of that and build the payload, the application, the way I want it to run, and then have it be infinitely scalable and automagically scalable on top of that infrastructure. And so we see containers as a power shift from ops to dev. And a significant thing to think about as you look at, going back to Scott's point, the importance of focusing on solutions that the developers first and foremost are going to love when we talk about these kinds of, kind of technologies.
Good. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about kind of a more mature market, and that being the SaaS market.
Yep.
And kind of, as that market has matured, it's a little bit different approach. It's providing more applications as a service as opposed to microservices. But, Matt, you had some thoughts on kind of the maturing SaaS market and how that's changing the way companies approach, selling into enterprises. And
well, I think as a startup, when you think about SaaS, it's really just a broader level of abstraction of what we were just talking about here. And it's playing off of some very similar trends. So specifically, we're talking about end user empowerment. Scott's talking about that end user being the developer. But more generally, if I'm an end user and I've got a problem to solve, and you've got a SaaS solution that I can solve it with, I can go out, I can find it, I can try it, usually for free. I can see if it's working for not just me, but the other people I'm working with, and I can adopt it. And that is just fundamentally transformational in terms of how software gets, learned about, tried, and it actually solves people's problems. As a result of that, I think that It's so important for companies that are early stage to be focused on that customer problem, that end user, building something that's not expansive, but it's specific to solving their problem and doing it in a way that they love, and then getting the usage from that. I mean, to me, a lot about the open source communities is like, hey, let's go get something out there and let's see how people use it and build upon it and collaborate around it. I think that's very true in the SaaS world. I mean, you could take two examples. Let's take an example from AWS. Last year, you launched Lambda. It was pretty basic, you know, as an event-driven engine. And now we've had 10 other things added to it and a whole bunch of new things launched, you know, in the last 24 hours. So over time, your customers and your users have driven you. Similarly, for us, we've got a company called Smartsheet. Smartsheet started out as a very simple, modern way for teams to collaborate, usually with one person at the middle of the team, kind of like, you know, collaboration, you know, for teams to get stuff done. Today, 6, 7 years later, they've got 70,000 paying customers. The smallest customers, which is the majority of the customers, tens of thousands of customers paying them $500 a year, but now there are enterprises paying them more than $500,000 a year. And so that learning motion from the bottoms up, empower an end user that you can go land and solve a problem for, but then learning over time how to expand the feature set, just like Lambda's doing, into and expand the selling motion into how do I sell into an enterprise who has an expectation of a set of abilities around securability, compliability, reliability, you can just go down the line. And that's what I think we're seeing more and more in the SaaS world from a land and expand perspective.
Good. Anything to share on that?
No, I mean, SaaS, I think, has been an incredible innovation in both business model and delivery. You know, it used to be, you know, 20 years ago that, you know, 100% of the software budget lived inside of the IT organization, right? And it's the CIO that controlled all of it. And, you know, today, I think Salesforce was probably the first one that kind of started pioneering that business model. But today, you know, you've got a $50 billion market that is the business buyer. You know, it's the CMOs, you know, buying marketing systems, and the CFOs buying, you know, NetSuite and other software tools. And the IT buyer is, you know, obviously still there, and they're buying technology, but now so much of that budget is shifting over to the business buyers. And it's very, you know, like Matt was saying, the really interesting thing to kind of be aware of there is that the way you sell into each of these organizations is so very different from one another. You know, the business buyers, really what they care about is trying the application and measuring the business impact and making sure that their workflows improve because of it. And, you know, the IT buyer we've seen is much more about the technology, and they want to understand the technology, and they want to make sure that the technology fits with their overall kind of technology and architecture perspective of the world, rather than just measuring, you know, the impact to the business. So it's, you know, they're both massive markets now, but they, you know, the interesting observation is that that's relatively new as of about, you know, 10, 15 years ago.
Well, I certainly think, you know, there's a lot of good that's come with SaaS, the shift from CapEx to OpEx. It's easy to try. You know, I think there's a class of SaaS applications that did little more than recreate what we had before, and now a web-delivered model. And so I think there's, you know, a lot of room to innovate there. The most interesting thing, and you sort of alluded to it with your comment on Lambda, is there's a much better data-driven opportunity to collect that customer feedback and figure out how to scale and grow over time. Right. And the companies we see that have a very systematic process for dealing with that data and gathering those learnings are the ones that successfully move up the curve before, and that was just very hard and impractical to do at scale until SaaS.
Yeah. No.
I was just going to, just off of that point, I guess what I would say is it feels like the first generation of, we're entering a new phase in SaaS, I think, and there's this first generation of SaaS companies really about taking traditional enterprise software and bringing it, you know, into the cloud for all the obvious, and with all the obvious benefits. But that was really about automating a business process. And what we see now, just another kind of play on the data theme here, is the companies that realize that all of a sudden, if you think about, like, for instance, Salesforce, they have all this interesting information sitting in there. They don't do anything with that to actually help you make you better at your job. What they do is help you kind of automate through that workflow. Now, you know, a generation of companies are sitting there realizing, man, there's all this really interesting data. Let's help our customers derive insight from that information and that data. And, you know, kind of back to the theme about thinking about long-term differentiation. I think the next wave of SaaS companies are going to be those that are going to be able to deliver more insight from that information.
Yeah, we even call it dataware. I mean, why call it software anymore? It's just not. I mean, we've turned infrastructure hardware into software as a infrastructure as a service. We're turning software into dataware. And the dataware that's going to really matter is the stuff that's really what you might think of as intelligent applications. I mean, what Zendesk came out this week talking about their ability to predict whether your customer's at risk or not based on using some text algorithms. You know, Workday can figure out whether or not your employee's at risk based on some stuff they're doing, sharing data with LinkedIn. You know, it goes on and on and on, and that's how we're going to think about things over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when you think about the first generation of SaaS companies, all of them pitch the idea of, you know, first we're going to get it, you know, in the cloud and deliver as a service, but now we're going to be sitting on all this data. There'll be so many cool services we can offer, and that was a great vision. But you know, it took 15 years in order to say, okay, now that first wave is done, and now we can focus on actually using, learning, and using data in order to power more intelligent kind of human workflows. And you know, we have a company called the VSO that you know, essentially takes sales roll-ups. And then gives you a better forecast for the VP of sales of what you're going to be doing this year, right? This quarter in terms of your revenue. And you know, if you think about it, that's exactly what they did in their head before. They take this salesperson's you know, forecast and they say, okay, he doesn't usually deliver. I'll discount that a little bit, then I'll roll it up myself. And now the software can do it for you in a much better way by just looking at the past and saying, okay, you know, when he said that, he really delivered that. So let me put that in the model.
I mean, and why is this happening now? There are really, I think, two reasons. One is the technical reason, in that it's less expensive to store and process data than ever has been before. But the other is, you know, equally important, if not more important, which is the behavioral change, which is people now have more trust. You know, the reason, one of the reasons this didn't happen before is because these guys were, all the SaaS companies were fighting the fear that, hey, you're going to have your data in the cloud, and you know, it's in the cloud, and you know, bad things can happen to it there. And the reality is, I think people are much more comfortable with the concept and the idea that, hey, it's safe there, and I trust how the companies that have my data are going to use my data.
Yeah. And that was a evolution that took, to your point, like 15 years.
Takes a while.
So lots of great insights. We're taking questions. If you have a question for any of the panelists, you can email it to vcinsights@amazon.com. So we're going to wrap up that portion, and we're going to move on to talking a little bit about some predictions, some things that our panelists have seen that give them insight into what they think will happen going forward. And we'll start out with the dreaded valuation creep. And Scott's insight or prediction for the next 12 months.
I would have given this prediction a year ago, and I might have given it a year before. So, you know, I really think that we've experienced a pretty remarkable time in the technology industry here for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, which is that, you know, companies have been able to raise money, lots of money, relatively inexpensively, allowing us to do some really interesting and disruptive things. And it's super exciting and really compelling. I think one of the things, though, that is becoming apparent is that perhaps, you know, the way that capital was deployed, the prices at which it was deployed at, the amount of money that some companies have raised, all those things, might lead to kind of lower returns on that capital than you know, we as investors might like, but frankly, entrepreneurs, you know, would like as well. And so I think that, you know, there are signs that we're starting to see the environment change a little bit, where particularly at the later stages for companies with traction, it'll become a little bit more difficult to raise capital as inexpensively as they have. It still won't be difficult to raise money, and you know, but I think it's going to require a change in behavior. I think from an investor standpoint, from an entrepreneur standpoint, board standpoint on these companies, to think differently about how we fund growth, and we can still kind of shoot for the stars with these really ambitious ideas, but we might have to do it perhaps more efficiently than we have been doing it over the last 4 or 5 years. And you know, I don't think I'm not predicting the end of the world here, because I really do believe that the opportunity set is more exciting than it's, you know, maybe has been in the technology scene in a long time, for a lot of the reasons we've already discussed here. And so I think that you know, it's a really exciting and compelling time, but you know, I think that trees don't grow to the sky, and I think that there's been some assumptions made that they will, in terms of how these companies have been built. So
as a startup founder or somebody who's thinking about going to raise some money, how do I need to change my way of thinking maybe versus the last 12 months?
Oh, I think there's a really clear answer to that: unit economics. I mean, I'm presuming now you've built what you're going to build, you know, at least the first generation of it, and you've got some kind of continuous learning cycle, but the most important thing is to understand your unit economics. And unit economics varies quite a bit by company. You know, for a company like Peached in our portfolio, or an Uber, it's all about city economics. Maybe it's driver economics, but I really think it's city economics. But in a lot of our more enterprise-oriented companies, it's about that selling unit, the combination of, and it's old-fashioned, but it still exists, an outside salesperson, a sales engineer, and some kind of inside sales support, and how does that cost effectively scale? And if you can't get that unit of economics right, then it's going to be really, you should be really hard pressed to be putting more capital behind your scaling up your sales organization. So you can slice this a lot of different ways. There's a lot of much smaller dollar price points and models, like out there, like the Twilios and others. But you've got to understand those unit economics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a return to normalcy. In some sense, we see perhaps a little bit less participation from investors that largely participate in the public markets, and then everyone is perhaps going a little bit back to where they used to be in those growth equity firms that had some clear bar for run rate or unit economics are starting to enforce it a little bit more. And the unit economics, it's hard to have those in a material way at seed or even Series A, and it's right. So it's after that first amount of capital has come in where this conversation is really going to come to bear.
Okay. So I think just to tie into that, we've benefited from the cost of capital being fairly inexpensive. Mm-hmm. And Errol, you and I were talking, you seem to think the cost of capital may be changing, and can you talk about that a little bit and how that might impact the fundraising efforts of companies in the next 12 months?
Sure. I mean, we're living in a world where the cost of capital is probably as low as it's been in many years. And so what that's done is create very inexpensive capital that can be used in order to fund companies. You're seeing that in the public markets, but you also see it a lot obviously in the private markets. And so when companies get funded, capital is inexpensive, and so the thing that gets compensated is really growth. And so as long as you're growing, raising future rounds and being able to get fresh new capital isn't a challenge. And I think once that starts changing, and the Fed's already said it's going to raise rates later this year, and obviously Wall Street watches that every day. But as soon as cost of capital starts going up, valuations I think are going to start coming back to like Jake said, back to normal. And then there's going to be, a different focus of not just looking at growth, but I think we're going to start looking at things like sales efficiency as well, especially in enterprise software where I spend most of my time. If you think about kind of the evolution of a company in kind of two major phases, the first phase is you get rid of the technology and the product risk, right? You have to build something that the market wants, and so you're iterating, your seed and sometimes your Series A are going to be getting you to a product that you can start selling in market and validating that, the technology can be built and that, you can build a product that the market demands. And then after that, it's really about sales, marketing, and go-to-market. And you have something that you can sell. How do you take capital and then you convert that capital into revenues? And that's what we think about as sales efficiency. So kind of that's something that we track very carefully. Kind of looking at what sales and marketing spend is being used up in one quarter and how much new revenues that's generating in the next quarter. And that's really kind of your engine of how do you take capital and transform it into revenues. And I think there's going to be a much closer focus on sales efficiency as we start seeing the cost of capital starting to increase. And so, as entrepreneurs, if you're thinking about, your next year's operating plan and putting, your 5-year plans in place, I would start paying special attention on how are you, taking those sales and marketing dollars and converting them into revenues, and how efficiently are you doing that? Like Matt said, are you using very expensive field sales for everything, or do you have an inside sales team that you can use in order to kind of move further along in the sales process before, encumbering the field sales? So there's a lot of different kind of ways to think about how to manage sales efficiency, but that's a really important metric as things start coming back to normal.
So do you guys factor cost of capital in when you're looking at companies? I mean, is that something that you've got in the back of your mind, and is it going to change, or how would it fundamentally change the way you look at companies in the next 12 months if the cost of capital goes up, meaningfully?
I don't think it's going to change the way that we approach early stage investing. One of the reasons is because, frankly, it's less expensive now to start a company than ever has been before. And a lot of what we're talking about are things that really impact just how fast you want to grow, rather than whether or not you can grow and really going after an opportunity. I think it will influence, as board members, the way that we advise our CEOs how they should manage a business over time. But frankly, I still, there's going to be plenty of capital available for us to go after really, really interesting and compelling and disruptive ideas. And, for somebody that's doing something very, very exciting, there will be every opportunity to fund that company. I think even in an environment where the cost of capital is higher. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be a secondary effect, not a primary effect, right? Nobody's going to think about, I'm growing my company at 100% and the cost of capital is now 5 or 10%, and so, maybe I should do something differently. In that respect, I don't think it's going to change any decisions, but I think it'll have the secondary effect of changing the supply of capital. Because, once the cost of capital starts going up, the supply of capital going into the public market is going to change. Okay. And that's going to have downward pressure on valuations, which means you're going to have a very different kind of thought process around how much traction do you need to get between this round and the next round in order for me not to have the dreaded down round.
So would it be fair to say it's going to affect later stage companies much more than early stage companies? So you're looking at a B or C round.
Right. Which is why it's top of mind for me.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So talked a little bit about valuations, a little bit about cost of capital and funding. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of one of the hot buzz markets in virtual reality and augmented reality, and some of the insights that Matt has gained over the last year that help him come up with his prediction for the next 12 months in that area.
Yeah, so this is an area I understand there's quite a bit of debate about down in Silicon Valley, but we have this view, and I think AWS is a good proof point of it, that things never change as much in a year as you think they're going to, and they change more in a decade than you could ever possibly imagine. And having seen the world of virtual reality and the early attempts in the 90s and the failure of it, and I think understanding now that because of these little devices we carry around in our pocket and the cost of the components of it and the quality of it, and most importantly, having seen 30 different experiences in VR and AR, from Microsoft HoloLens to various and sundry applications running on top of Oculus or Valve or Sony VR, PlayStation VR, the time is now. There's no doubt in our minds. Having said that, I think the next year is going to be a little bit, especially the next 9 months, might be a little bit of one of these small, kind of valleys of disillusionment, because I don't think Valve's actually going to get there as quickly as they're hoping for on this first generation headset. I don't think it's going to make it for the holidays. Probably Oculus has got some more challenges, even though they had a very good show a couple of weeks ago. And Sony probably pushes into Q3 next year. So I actually think if you said the next 12 months, I think we're going to have some level of disillusionment, but keep the faith. If you're a believer in this category, the kinds of things that we're seeing in and we're investing in, we believe are going to be just foundationally disruptive. And I'll just give you 2 quick ideas. We're looking really hard at a company that basically takes all of your existing apps and operating systems and can move them into a VR environment so you can have a personal virtual unlimited workspace. That layer of software is a highly disruptive layer that if these guys can pull it off, and I've seen their progress over the last 12 months and believe they can really build a very interesting business around it. It's a company called Envelop VR. Another example is the concept of shared presence. In other words, why do the 4 or 5 of us need to actually be here physically when we could be in different places? Insight number 1 of that is that to have shared presence of people that are physically in different places, you fundamentally need to have a cloud as a server. In fact, these guys that I'm thinking of are architecting it with your cloud as their server. And then secondly, there's all kinds of things you can do, not just from the interactivity that we have or the tools we can play within that virtual environment, or even some of the really important work that needs to be done with sound, so that right now, I'm talking to Scott, it's the audio of that in a shared presence environment. There's just fundamentally cool work to be done. Okay. And having experienced some of these, spent literally hours in some of them over the last several months, it is prime time for them. I mean, and so over the next 3 to 5 years, we're big believers in VR and AR, and some things in the middle that some call mixed reality really coming on the scene and being disruptive.
If VR means I don't get to go to Vegas on a business trip every couple of months, I'm going to be really ticked off.
Hopefully it won't come to that.
I saw Netflix announce that they're going to be available on the Oculus. Yeah,
yep.
That was very cool. Now you can sit by yourself on a big screen and watch it.
Yeah, no,
I can see it.
So Jake, any thoughts on VR? Is it all it's being hyped up to be?
You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the actual applications of VR are and what the core underlying fundamental technologies are that we find compelling. And if we step back for a minute, we're really excited about the computer vision element of it, whether it's things like feature detection to understand what's going on, or obstacle avoidance that I think is going to become increasingly important in drones and all forms of robotics. And the question that we grapple with for consumers are what are the right use cases. I think the ideas in the enterprise are well defined, what's going to capture the consumer zeitgeist in terms of what's acceptable. I mean, we had little glasses not too long ago on people's eyes, and like what actually people are comfortable with, right? It's going to take time. It's not going to be an overnight change. So we're eagerly anticipating a better understanding of those things, and we're staying very close, and we're very excited.
Good. Okay. So last prediction will go to you, Jake. And we touched on this a little bit earlier about data-driven software and all the things that you can now do to have kind of continuous updating of applications and things like that by using data. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on trends there.
Yeah. So every day when I get to work, if I log into my Facebook or my LinkedIn or my Google for a minute to check something out, I'm always struck by just how much crunching is going to surface that next little tidbit that I care deeply about, right? It's personalized to me. And then I open all my work applications, my email, my spreadsheets, everything else, and I'm just sort of astounded by the contrast, that lack of personalization. And when you step back and think about it and understand some of the architectures that a lot of these consumer web companies had to put in place, they were grappling with these phenomenal amounts of data at a scale that no one else really had to deal with, and they had to build their own technologies. And fortunately for us, they started open sourcing a lot of these technologies. And I think the best success case has been Hadoop and the burgeoning ecosystem around it. And that's really empowered a whole new set of data management vendors, right? And the question has always been, when are we actually going to see that be built upon? And a couple years ago, I'd argue it's very hard. You need people that are experts in the core infrastructure technology. How do we set up? How do we run it? We need this mythical data scientist who knows everything about statistics, mathematics, like the domain you're in, and can program numerical calculations at scale, parallelized, and someone that actually was an expert in the domain. And that was just like a really hard recipe. And I think the thing I'm most excited about is the maturation of some of these underlying platform technologies, whether it's the open source vendors themselves or cloud services that are just making a lot of things easier, to the point where I think we're now at the point where the two guys in the garage are not going to have to go batty to take an idea of how they can improve a workflow and actually make it more data-driven. And you alluded to Salesforce, which I think is in the midst of a change, right? But is a great example. A lot of CRM applications are simply data entry applications. So I am going to enter something into my CRM because if I don't, my manager will not pay me. I don't get any value out of entering that in. And one of the companies I think we were both involved with was a company called RelateIQ, and they sucked in all that data, and they didn't do anything tremendously profound. They said, hey, this has a question mark. Maybe it's a question, should you want to set up a response? Here's all the things that are going on with all these people that are on this thread. Here's the last email. Do you want to create a reminder? And it turns out they needed a really big amount of data processing and crunching to make that happen. But what happened by doing that is they took a tool that, for some, is a tool that they didn't want to go into. Maybe they went in once a week, to a tool that I can't live without going in every day. Right. So I go into that tool every day. I get some value out of it, and guess what? All of a sudden, my manager has much more accurate information every single day. And that sort of mental change, well, it's small, right? That's the bar for what I think how every single enterprise application should be improved. And I don't think it's necessarily some fancy machine learning or deep learning that we need to get to the next level. It's just some very basic heuristic things that are impacting my workflow to bring the data information to me that I want. And I think that's going to start to happen in a big way next year.
It's back to what Matt said. This is, comes with this pretty profound way and change in the way in which software is sold, where it used to be top down, so you'd build things that your managers or the bosses want, where you roll those stuff to things where we really need to figure out a way to make the end users happy. And the best way to do that I've seen so far is to do exactly what Jake just described.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and the one other thing, I mean, we've got a company called Dato, D-A-T-O, and what they do is they provide, it's actually the Amazon professor of machine learning at the University of Washington, Carlos Gestrin, and he was here at the conference. And they make it easy for you to go from insight to production and use, it doesn't have to be fancy, kind of toolkits, or it doesn't have to be fancy algorithms, but they're basically allowing you to take the basics of machine learning and other algorithmic techniques and turn your applications into intelligent applications. Salesforce is a customer, Pandora, Spotify, Johnson & Johnson. I mean, you go down the list, Capital One, who was on stage yesterday. I mean, they're just knocking it out of the park in terms of these kind of customers, and it's because there is that need to create intelligent apps.
So if you're a CTO or you're head of product somewhere and you're not thinking about this, you better get on your horse and start working on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the way I put it, there's going to be data-driven software and crappy software.
Yeah, exactly. So wonderful, great set of predictions as well. We have time for a few questions. So I'm actually going to ask each of you guys to answer this first one because I think it's interesting. And this comes from John Charles. What areas or verticals do you think have large potential but aren't getting enough attention from entrepreneurs and startups? We'll just start with Matt and work our way down.
An area that we actually saw a presentation earlier today, but I think there's a lot more opportunity, is the whole area of agriculture. And you take combinations like the data, which was featured in the John Deere segment today, but talk about drones.
Yeah.
And what, through the data I can capture through a drone and my ability to identify that this is an area that is not growing as quickly, or this is an area that is got a weed infestation or whatever it might be, combine that with a sensor, Internet of Things if you want it. I think there's so many transformational opportunities in agriculture, and that's a big vertical market that people are overlooking.
Scott?
It's a hard one to answer because there's so much money floating around in this ecosystem now that it's like very few areas where I would say, God, that is underserved right now. I mean, there are things that go in and out of favor. I think one of the areas that's out of favor right now is things that aren't cloud-based, traditional data center hardware, infrastructure, and software. And, there's probably a set of opportunities there because this transition will take a long time. Although it's accelerating at this point. I would have said last year I would have said healthcare, but what's amazing in the last 12 months is just how much entrepreneurial activity has emerged and how much money has been invested in that space and trying to think about how do we transform the experience for patients and payers and providers. So.
Okay.
I agree with this sentiment. I don't know if there's anything that's truly underinvested, but I mean, there's a lot of areas where there's tremendous inflows in money in sales and marketing technology, security, et cetera. And I think there's so many business processes in middle America, whether it's agriculture or shipping or construction, and all of these industries have an opportunity to be reinvented, hopefully in a more data-driven way. And there, at least, you don't have 500 different startups going after the exact same thing. So, you could argue that maybe some of these opportunities are slightly more constrained. Some of them are not. Some of them are quite large. Sure. But there's a different competitive environment.
What's interesting is I think in an environment like we're in right now, where it is a bit frothy and there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity, you see the next startups tend to be building things that other startups would want to use. And we very much are in that, which is why you see so much in things like sales and marketing, where you've all these companies embracing next generation sales and marketing techniques, and they're people they're building for that. And it's just to your point, it's interesting is that we probably lose sight of things from time to time because we see so much of these startups around, and we start to think of them as the customers. But there's obviously vast industries that are out there that aren't based in Silicon Valley that need to be revolutionized. So.
I guess the only one, I agree with the general sentiment that the market pretty much defines which verticals are get capital, and now there's a lot of capital flowing. But one area that I think could use a lot of innovation that hasn't had as much investment is government, and startups that are helping governments operate more efficiently, whether it's open data initiatives, and there's a couple of companies there, or it's more transparent government, helping kind of the democratic process and helping people interact better with their local governments and state and national. there hasn't been much innovation there, largely because it's so hard to sell into, and so investors don't love those kinds of business models. But that's an area that's very much underserved by tech companies.
Okay, good. So another question, a little more basic around funding, but it's a question that I hear all the time from startups that I work with, especially early stage. And there are a lot of different variations of this, so I'd say maybe pick one. But what are you guys looking for in terms of traction when somebody comes to you looking for a seed round? And
Seed round?
A seed round, and then we'll talk about Series A. And it's going to be radically different if it's a consumer-focused company versus an enterprise-focused company versus somebody who's building infrastructure. But I get this question 2 or 3 times a week from startups that say, we're thinking about going and raising our Series A, and here's what we've got. Is that going to resonate, or are we ahead of ourselves? So,
well, we do 40% of our deals are seed, and so I guess I would say 0. We're not looking for traction at all at that phase. What we're looking for is that you have got some problem that you probably experienced yourself firsthand in a prior context, and you are passionate about, and you can convince us that you're capable of solving that problem better than anybody else has ever done that before, and that you want to pour your heart and soul into doing it. And there's that triangle there, right, of the problem, your ability to solve it, and having that right kind of DNA and entrepreneurial alignment. And we see that, and usually that's somebody that we've probably worked with in the past, to be fair, because we've seen that passion in them before and seen what they can deliver. It's not always the case, but that's the triangle we're looking for in a seed round.
And then do you guys, is there a market size you also look for as well?
Well, I think that look, you can convince yourself of any market size in these things. So I care much more, as we were talking about before, that there's this end user that has a problem of some kind, and this team is passionate about going and solving it, and they think they can really build an elegant, easy to use, easy to adopt, people are going to love the solution kind of solution. And that, by the way, doesn't have to be something that's going to be out in 3 months. Scott and I co-invested in the seed round together of a company that's going to take $30 million to build and bring their first product to market. They're doing it in a very agile way.
Right.
They're doing it in a category where they know a lot of it, since it's a next generation storage. But they had that right passion. They had the right domain knowledge. They'd seen the problem.
Okay, good. Scott?
I would say the same thing. I mean, just to be transparent, I think the more data we need more data, the less confidence we have in a space or an opportunity, right?
Okay.
And so, when we need to be convinced is when we look for that data. And so in those situations at the seed level, we might not be the right partner, because what you really want when you look for a seed investor is somebody that's just really passionate about the idea and the concept and the team. And you need to find an investor that at that seed level that feels that way and wants to kind of take the leap with you. So it obviously changes as we go along, right? And as you get into the later stages, the process is different. But for a seed stage, it's really about just belief. Do you believe?
Yeah, I've heard the adage, and it sounds kind of working towards at the seed stage, you're investing in the team and the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is that?
I think it can be slightly different. I think there's some consumer applications where some amount of demonstrated traction is potentially necessary, particularly if it's a team you don't know. The thing I'd share is that for me at least, the process of building a startup is a systematic process of risk reduction, right? Mm-hmm. So, hey, I have this huge end goal in mind. I need to build a multi-billion-dollar company, and I'm very passionate about this space. Let's go do it. One of the mistakes I often see a lot of people make at the really early stage of how they spend their time is doing what they do best, spending time doing what they do best. And if a guy is an expert in storage systems, I got to tell you, I'm probably going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he can build the thing that he has in his head, right? I'm going to validate it, and depending on how much business credibility he has, he'd be much better served by going and talking to the market and doing the thing that he's not as good at, or to reduce that risk. And so that element of team and how much risk is present, and then to your point, the progress is really just how much proof do you need to be at a risk point where you can tolerate making that an investment. But all too often people do the thing that it is that they are really good at the beginning and don't spend any time trying to validate the thing that they might actually need a little bit of help with.
Yeah, we don't do any seed investing, but at our stage where we typically come in at B and C rounds, Really what we're looking for is a product market fit. And then, depending on what category you're in, there's just a lot of different ways of judging what that product market fit is. Revenues is a great way. Anything from the first dollar of revenues is often enough for us to get convinced that there's a product market fit there. And then the other piece is, that we look for is, have you figured out at least some initial way of getting to the market? Have you thought about, what your sales motion is going to be, how you're going to be selling, and do you have any demonstrated traction that you've been able to do that successfully? Because really what we're trying to answer in our heads is, if we give you, 10, 15, $20 million, are you going to be able to take that and hire, 10 more salespeople and 10 more marketing people and really scale? And so having demonstrated traction and being able to do that is what we're looking for.
That's great. Well, that's all we unfortunately have time for. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and I'd say thank you to our panelists for taking the time to come out here and share their thoughts.